prayer. I asked Alma to pray because this is one of the first times I've ever written something that wasn't just my work, and so I want to make sure that I present it in a way that's understandable and that really emphasizes where this work originates from and comes from. And so I just want to honor Alma for saying that prayer. So the Indigenous cultural responsivity theory, oh, you're going to do it? Sorry. It actually has several authors. The first author is the Federation of Saskatchewan, well, the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, which used to be the Federation of Saskatchewan Indians, FSIN. And they began engaging in community consults around 2011 when, could you go ahead and forward it for a second? When a memorandum of understanding was signed between the Saskatchewan government, the Canadian government, and the Federation itself. So additional authors on this are FSIN, Shawneen P., and Kim McKay McNabb. And, but I'm the primary theory generator, so I'll be the one to engage in the conversation about the theory. So why the Indigenous cultural responsivity theory? So when FSIN engaged in community consultations, one of the main findings of their research was that any kind of change that's going to happen within health and education systems, any kind of culturally responsive change, will only occur through the people who are trained and practice in that system, through their own attitudinal change and education. And the feasibility of that will be dependent upon the systems themselves. So our own people actually recognize that change is only going to happen with our allies in the systems. So I just want to acknowledge that the developers of this model, FSIN, Shawneen, Kim, and I, acknowledge that the spirit of Indigenous peoples has been wounded. And it's through culture-based healing that the recovery, restoration, and rebuilding of identity, which includes individual, family, and community, and nations, and that's Angela Snowshoe's work, will take place. So there's a recognition in this work that that culture will be a healing factor for Indigenous people, and we have scientific evidence, which you'll soon see, that that is indeed the case. I just want to tell you so I'm calling it the ICRT. I want to tell you what it is before I get into the nuts and bolts of it. So it's a decolonizing model aimed to improve First Nations health status and eliminate the health disparities that exist between First Nations and non-First Nations people in Saskatchewan. So with this theory, because it engaged community consults across Saskatchewan, across the province, it is said to speak for all Indigenous people within the province, and we've never had anything speak for all of us. I mean, we always make sure that when we present that we say, I am not speaking on behalf of all First Nations, and this is the first time I've seen something speak on behalf of all First Nations people. This framework was designed to build on capacity and collaborations to conduct responsive, equitable, innovative, patient-oriented research, and when we say patient-oriented, that's the new move on the province's governance side is going towards patient-oriented research, which really means community-based. So I'll use patient-oriented or community-based research interchangeably. So it's the focus is that we continuously improve the care, the health, the well-being, the education, and the research and governance of Indigenous peoples in the province. It's founded by Indigenous community members throughout Saskatchewan through community engagement, cultural ceremony, and protocols. And it was enlivened by Indigenous scholars. So once FSIN came up with the initial research, then they asked Shawneen Pete, Kim McKay McNabb, and myself, 3 Indigenous scholars, to enliven it into theory. And that's what this has turned out to be. And so it provides the necessary strengths and evidence-based, trauma-informed framework to develop culturally responsive care across disciplines. Okay, we can go to practical aspects. It's designed to foster relationship building between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous allies who seek to improve Indigenous health and wellness. It's developed to work with First Nations communities and individuals. It's created to serve as a model for practitioners, teachers, counselors, policymakers, healthcare practitioners. It engages Indigenous methodologies and ways of knowing and being with evidence-based practices, best Western practices. And it's to create a resource that is at the forefront of current and emerging research on the use of culture as an intervention within the field of Indigenous counseling and psychology. It can also assist with the transmission, application, and evaluation of knowledge across individuals and groups. I've actually been testing this theory. Well, we started writing it around June-ish, and I've been testing it in every element of my work. Individual relationships, one-on-one counseling relationships. I worked with 12 First Nations and used it with them. I've worked with our own faculty in mostly non-Indigenous, and just recently came back from Alberta where I worked with only white people. And so it seems to be working across spectrums of, I just think it's a model that can be used in any setting. So clinicians will be able to use this theory to provide or direct patient care. Organizations should be able to develop health, wellness, and treatment programs. Education settings may use this to guide curricular development and engagement, and this theory may be used as preparation for reconciliation. Where I've presented it so far, I presented it to 12 First Nations communities that was sponsored by INAC in August. I'm presenting it today, and I'm presenting it at the Department of Psychiatry Grand Round on November 8th. So FSIN has really positioned us to get the word out that this is the theory that they would like to be used when dealing with Indigenous peoples in Saskatchewan. Would you agree to that? I've used it so far in my Counseling Girls and Women, group counseling, and my undergrad teaching as a helping profession course. I've used it in the development of our new healing lodge that's getting opened on the second floor. And I use it in my Sito-Skako and Indigenous expressive therapies. I use it in every aspect of my work, and it seems to be doing very well. So again, I think I already mentioned that this came out of a memorandum of understanding between the First Nations Health and Wellbeing between the Government of Canada, the Ministry of Health, and the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, which I said the wrong name. And the aim is simply to improve the health status and then eliminate the health disparities that exist between First Nations and non-First Nations people. And when I say health, that encompasses everything: education, social determinants of health. So and you'll see soon, our definition of health is inclusive of education and everything. Everything falls under health for us. So, okay, I already said some of this. One thing I just want to again reiterate is that so FSIN and Assembly of First Nations are supporting this framework, which again, that takes it nationally now that you have the Assembly of First Nations. They actually created a resolution number 63 and adopting and implementing a cultural responsiveness framework. So even though we're asserting that it only is speaking for First Nations in the province, it seeks to possibly be more widespread than just Saskatchewan. I've left some, I'm going to skip some pieces in the PowerPoint, but I put them in so that you would know a little bit about the history. I'll just briefly explain, and I did not know this until I was engaged in this work, that Saskatchewan covers the treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. It's called the Sacred Blanket of Treaties. So I was quite unaware that Saskatchewan had that. And with respect to one of the things that also surprised me was that when signing the treaties, the parties agreed that their citizens would not only survive, but prosper. So how we've gotten to where we are with that concept behind the treaties, I'm not sure. Another piece that I found particularly stunning was that First Nations did not surrender their traditional healing practices or medicines when they signed the treaties. Instead, First Nations stood to protect their own health system and supplement this section with Western medical care and medicines, which then means we should be the healthiest people in the province if we're supplementing, and that obviously is not happening. So that was a bit of a revelation to me because it realigned my belief in the work that we've always been doing, which is try to reclaim our ways of knowing. So there's several theoretical components to this theory. If it gets confusing, please just interrupt me and ask questions, because it's a lot. And if you don't know Indigenous theory, it's going to be a lot to take in. So I'll do my best to describe the constructs, and then I'll put it all together at the end and show you how they work together. So first of all, there's an assertion that participation within Indigenous culture and ways of being is an approach in which First Nations people experience success and recovery from colonization. This has now been scientifically validated. We don't have to argue it anymore. It works. Culture works for us as a people. Dr. Michael Yellowbird founded that through historical literature and narratives of Indigenous people and contemporary neuroscience, that research supports the healing effectiveness of traditional Indigenous contemplative practices such as mindfulness, meditation, prayer, visualization, ceremonies, and he refers to this as neurodecolonization. So I just want to unpack that a little bit because it's a big word that seems a little frightening, but really all of neurodecolonization is participation in ceremonies, mindfulness activities, etc. And so we use the first ever scientifically validated research to create a model with culture as at the apex. So culture is the apex of this model, and it's woven through an operationally defined construct of Native wellness. What does that mean? That we actually, for the first time, have a definition of Native wellness, and I'm going to go over that with you. This is landmark. This research is landmark. The article just came out in 2016, and it's the first to quantitatively validate linking shifts in the experience of culture intervention practices to wellness through the conception of culture as intervention. So basically what that's saying is culture as an intervention, culture in and of itself is an intervention. So this is an intervention. Having a pipe ceremony is an intervention. Anything that we do with the culture is promoting healing and wellness, and that's now scientifically validated. And the citation's in the PowerPoint. So there's a few other theories that go into this. We engage Ermine's ethical space, and this actually emerged out of FSIN's community consults. The people, the communities themselves defined, and I don't know if they use the word ethical space, but they used the idea of converging in a space that was sacred, and Willie Ermine was a part of this, so obviously his ethical space of engagement came out. Is anyone familiar with the ethical space? Yeah, okay, so basically it's just saying that you kind of shed who you are and where you come from, and you come into this space that I'm defining as sacred, and you engage this other piece that will come in, you engage the community perspective, so the Indigenous perspective, and ways of knowing. So if that community engages it through pipe or sweat or circle, however the community defines that when you come into that ethical space. I also want to point out that not everyone can enter the ethical space. If you haven't done your own work on the outside, coming into the ethical space is not going to be of service. Now, I'll give you an example this weekend. I just did a workshop with all non-Indigenous people, and often anger, guilt, and shame come up when we start to do this decolonizing work. And what happens when we do that is we have to disrupt the process, and usually it's Indigenous people who start to take care of the people who are feeling anger, guilt, and shame, and then we can go back to our process once that happens. We are not in this position, in this model, we are not disrupting that space to take care of those emotions. That's when people might need to step outside the ethical space or not even enter until they've sort of managed that, and then they can come in. The ethical space is the place to position Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing from the community perspective, whoever that community is, and then to engage and look at from Marshall's two-eyed seeing model. Does anyone know Marshall's two-eyed seeing? The best Indigenous ways of knowing alongside of the best Western ways of knowing, or evidence, in this case for us, because it's health, evidence-based Western practices. So in that ethical space, we come together and we start to look at what's the best Indigenous ways of knowing that harmonize with the best evidence-based practices. And out of that begins the birth of the theory. Does that make sense? I'm really hoping this makes sense. You want to add anything? Just jump in if you do, okay. I'm going to skip over to Native wellness as a construct. So as an Indigenous, so this is the first time we actually have an operational definition. So they went into ceremony, and they engaged elders, and they came up with a definition. And in summary, the definition is wellness is an inclusive state or position of balance where the spirit, heart, mind, and body work together through the primary unified concepts of culture. This is where the key is, which renders culture in and of itself an intervention towards wellness. So I'm going to unpack this because this is probably the crux of it. The biomedical definition of health looks at health as being the absence of disease. So if you don't have disease, you're healthy. The First Nations perspective in general is not that. The First Nations perspective on health is that you have a balance between the mental, the emotional, the spiritual, and the physical. And it's in trying to get the balance between the mental, emotional, and physical that spirit happens. So it's in those processes of achieving balance, going to ceremonies, self-care, working with community, that spiritual awakenings occur. I'm not going to read the whole definition of native wellness as a construct, but I did put it in there. It's really beautiful, but it's a lot if you're first exposed to it. We could spend the whole hour just on talking about the differences in how Indigenous people perceive health and wholeness. What I would say, though, is also James Dumont. So James Dumont's an elder from my community. He also has a PhD. When I was just finishing my undergrad, I think it was my undergrad. I was in a ceremony with him, and I was telling him I'm going to go get a PhD and I'm going to do all these things. And he said, until you get grounded in your culture, you should not move any further in your education. Because if you do that, you will never be able to help your people. You'll only be trained in one way. And I took that very seriously, and I really engaged in ceremony a lot more before entering my master's program. So what Dumont did with some others, if you can go to the next slide, is they came up with five concepts that are pretty universal across all Indigenous peoples on the planet. And I'm just going to summarize them. It's basically that we see life and we are motivated by spirit. And I know I've been challenged on that by non-Indigenous people who claim that I'm essentializing our people. But every Indigenous person I've ever asked would agree to that. Even we're colonized, so some of us may not practice that, but certainly our initial teachings are that we're caregivers of the earth, and we have a spiritual reason, and we are motivated by spirit, and we are contacted by spirit. And if you can embrace that concept alone, you'll understand our ways of knowing much, much better. So the circle, more than any other symbol, is expressive of the Indigenous worldview. So when I came into this room, I felt angst. The minute the circle was created, it went away. So that, to me, tells me, again, that our culture, for me, it works for me. That Indigenous culture is virtually voiced and transmitted through language. So someone like me who doesn't have language, that's a huge loss. And one of the things Dr. Snowshoe talks about is that people who experience, Indigenous people experience thoughts of cultural loss on an average of 4 to 7 times a day. So that Indigenous people experience feelings of cultural loss about 4 to 7 times a day. So like today, I feel sad that I can't speak my language, or I might have another experience later on today that, you know, I can't do something in my way of knowing. I felt uncomfortable walking in and seeing a room set up in this way. So there's always that remnant of cultural loss. And that all universal things, human and nature, are related. So this is written very academically, so I'm just going to try to break it down. So what does that mean? That we're connected to plants, animals, the earth. I mean, we can kind of see that going on the planet right now. Global warming or climate change is certainly nothing to do with anything but the interconnectedness of what's going on the planet. A perfect example would be, sometimes people will say to me, well, why don't your people just leave the reserve? Why don't they just go to the cities? And so an example might be that we have a ceremony in which for my son, we buried his placenta in the ground on his reserve. And so someday, if we had to leave that place, I would feel horrible because he's rooted on that reserve, and his placenta will decay and feed the soil, and the plants will grow and will eat that fruit. So we become one with the whole aspect of the land. And so to just uproot and go to the city, which people say to us all the time, doesn't make sense to us. We're very connected to the land, and that's just one example of how that plays out in my life. And that through life stages, everyone is predisposed to have a desire to be respectfully harmonious and in balance with creation. And that seems like a big, tall order, but when you're living off the land and you're engaging in ceremonies and you're practicing the ways of knowing, and even if you're not Indigenous and you live off the land, you automatically have to harmonize with the surroundings around you. So these 5 concepts are basically what cut across all Indigenous cultures. Any questions on these or comments? Okay, so there's a few words now being touted. Culture as intervention, culture-based healing. These are interchangeable, I think. They're pretty much the same. Culture as intervention is based upon the Fidelity Van Dyck article, which I've cited, and culture-based healing is Angela Snowshoe's work. And basically it's just saying using culture as a healing protective factor. That's really as simple as it is. Then there's the two-eyed seeing model. I'm just going to skip through this because I've kind of talked through it. I'm just using the PowerPoint as a guide. So we can go to the next one. So I've talked about the two-eyed seeing in the ethical space. And this is where, can I go down to Snowshoe slide? One more. So this is where the model starts to change. So we're in the ethical space, we're engaging two-eyed seeing, best of Western ways, best of Indigenous ways, and then I'm adding Snowshoe and Star Blankets work. And what that basically is 4 protective factors. And those 4 protective factors are seeing, and that's using Indigenous epistemologies, story, which is acknowledging the story and the history and the background, and that's trauma sensitive, trauma informed. Each one of these constructs I could spend a lot of time teaching you about today. I'm not going to do that because they're very complex, but everything that I do in my work comes from a trauma sensitive place. I'm in the counseling field, so when you do any work, you should always acknowledge the fact that Indigenous people are wounded people, and we have been traumatized. Maybe not directly, but certainly through historical experiences and intergenerational experiences. Healing, the healing protective factor is strengths-based, and that's that culture-based healing, culture is intervention. And then teaching, so the fourth protective factor is teaching, and that's community-focused. So in that ethical space, with Ermine's ethical space and with the two-eyed seeing, we're engaging in a community-focused experience. So a couple of people have asked me, well, what if the community is not spiritual? That's fine, because if you're in the ethical space and they're not spiritual, or maybe they're Christian, you're consulting with the community. So they're enacting their own protocols. So you'll never go in and dictate the protocols. The community will tell you, this is how we do it. We don't want to pray. We want to use a Christian prayer. We want to not enact ceremony at all. So this is why it works, because the first thing you do is check in with community, and community will tell you, this is how we need to move forward and how we need to approach this. And then that's when the evidence-based Western practices will harmonize, and then you'll add the strengths-based, trauma-informed, protective factors over it. So what does that mean? That means that if I'm creating a treatment center, for example, for a First Nation, that they'll tell me what's going on in their history and in their lives and what ceremonies they'd like to see enacted, and then we'll go figure out from a Western model and from literature what works, and then we'll bring it back to community and we'll say, hey, do you think sharing circles would work? Do you think equine therapy would work? And then we would engage it in that model. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'd like to refer to, sometimes Angela refers to her protective factors as blankets. I like to refer to them as medicines, mashkigi, medicines that we pick up and we put in our intervention bundle. So what I like about this theory too is, for me, I've been using it in so many ways, that even if all I do is pick up the protective factors of strengths-based trauma-informed, I'm enacting the model, if I just keep that in mind. So maybe I'm not doing work with a community, but I'm getting ready to do this presentation. I'm going to make sure it's strengths-based and trauma-informed. When my students are doing their interventions in their assignments, they have to do interventions in the communities, they have to be strengths-based and trauma-informed. I may not be able to get them into an ethical space, I may not be able to get them to community consult, but they can definitely do trauma-sensitive work. I think we could spend, I've included slides on trauma-informed, but I'm not going to go over it because there's so many constructs here that it's overwhelming. But if you are interested, look at work of Malakiti, just Google trauma-sensitive, trauma-informed work, and you'll find a lot of literature to support your work. And I've talked to one of our associate deans about even our faculty should be coming from this model, and a lot of people don't know how. It's actually not difficult to do. So maybe this is the start of having that conversation about what it looks like. Okay, can you go to the next one? So I do want to talk a minute about strengths-based versus deficit-based. 99% of the literature and the work that we see is deficit-based. What does that mean? There's so many suicides in First Nations communities. There's so many this, there's so many that. We don't need more work that talks about what's wrong with our people. I just reviewed an article written by Indigenous scholars for a journal, and it reported everything from a deficit. And I basically flipped it back and said they need to flip their stats. Come at it, tell me how many people are doing well. Tell me how many people have succeeded. Tell me how many people are doing good works, because we don't need to know how many people aren't doing well anymore. We know why they're not doing well, and we know what's caused it. So let's start looking at how they do well, how they do better, and how to make that work. And it's sneaky, because I'll give you an example. One of my students last night from another country said that he wanted to do his intervention in counseling girls and women on domestic violence for survivors. And I said, okay, tell me what that would look like for you. And he described it. And so it was kind of like a survivor group for domestic violence. And I said, well, why wouldn't you call it a group for empowering women, or a group of engaging women in self-esteem, or, flip it. You got to flip it. It can creep in. I do it sometimes. I use one scale called the ACE, the Adult Aversive Childhood Experiences Scale. It's 10 questions. It's not strengths-based. It tells me a lot really quickly. I struggle with it because it is deficit-based, but I'm aware that it's deficit-based, and I try to make sure that I counter it with something strengths-based, like a resiliency scale or a scale of wellness or a scale of wholeness. So instead of going in and measuring, this is tough to teach too, because in my Indigenous qualitative research course, when I stressed it over and over again, I still had one final project come up with questions like, how many suicides happen in your community? How many stillbirths happen in your community? And again, like, even though I spent a semester trying to teach strengths-based trauma-informed, it still can come out, because that's how we're trained. We're trained to look at the deficits. So just even being mindful in your own work as you move forward, are you coming from a deficit model or a strengths-based model, could really alter the experience for First Nations people. I'm going to go to the neurodecolonization slide for a minute. I think Michael Yellowbird's work is absolutely crucial for our people. Why? Because he's using MRI scans before and after, and he's adding to the literature to show that the brain changes on ceremony and mindfulness. And numerous other studies are starting to come out to scientifically validate that as well. We're not going to go sit outside a sweat lodge with an MRI scan. It's never going to happen. It wouldn't be respectful. But we know that it works. So finally, Western evidence is catching up with Indigenous knowledge. Often Indigenous knowledge is seen as second best or not good, but really science is starting to validate our knowledge along the way. And so I think it's crucial that we acknowledge his work. He's challenging to unpack if you don't know these concepts. I've been aggressively challenged by using his work, aggressively by saying things like, well, you just can't take yoga mats into a First Nations community, or you can't decolonize brain cells. But the reality is that everything that happens to us first happens in the mind. So when we experience colonization, if we don't decolonize the mind, we can't decolonize the body, we can't decolonize anything else. So it's that first step in sort of getting that mindfulness back, understanding where you are, and moving forward from there. And in trauma work, it's critical to have mindful moments, because you have to engage the body, the mind, and the spirit in order to do trauma work. So in conclusion, how are we doing for time? Because I want to have a discussion. So the basics of this model are that it uses groundbreaking research. So it's that Fidelity article, and I'm probably pronouncing Fidelity, I don't know her name, Fidelity, that really operationally defined Native wellness and scientifically validated that culture is an intervention in and of itself. This particular model was created solely by Indigenous people, and one of the things Whitbeck says, Whitbeck is a white male who does a lot of work with Indigenous ways of knowing, but he says that Indigenous scholars at some point, and his work said this about 10 years ago, that Indigenous scholars need to lead the way in this work. And finally, I think we're at a place, we're what, second or third generation PhDs, maybe second, third-ish, PhDs who can finally now take advantage of our communities doing their own community consult research, and then we pick up the theory. This is a first. This has never happened before. So when I was growing up, there was only one Native PhD that I knew, and then James Dumont. That was it. Now I look around and we have 3 in the room. So this is a blessing and a miracle. And then just again, that this scientific evidence validates culture as an intervention, as a necessary form of prevention and healing from traumatic events, that we have to have our culture back. And so it's very challenging in these settings to have it, very challenging, because sometimes when we ask or try to position our ways of knowing first, we get challenged. So, and it gets frustrating, and then our own health and wellness becomes challenged and problematic because we're consistently, I'll just give you an example. I got a grant my first year here. I was so proud, so honored, and I said, what should I do? Like at home, I'd have a feast. Okay, have a feast. Well, the students might like a round dance, so have a round dance. Okay, I don't know what that is, but I'll do it. And there was no feasting policy here, and there was no smudging policy here. So before I could have a feast and a round dance, which I could have walked across the green and had it over at FNU in a week, I had to wait 1.5 years here to develop a policy and get it through the system and have meetings with bureaucrats and tell them why it was important to have a smudging policy and argue against the allergists and the people who can't handle smoke and the fire people who said we'd set off sprinklers. So about 1.5 years later, we had a smudging policy. and a moderately acceptable feasting policy. We still can't bring in wild meat, which at a feast, that's what a feast is. So we have a policy. But that's the kind of thing that, in order to do the work we do, we first have to, I don't feel like I'm a policy person, but I first have to engage policy in order to be able to do the work that I want to do. And it's exhausting, and it's frustrating, and I think you could speak a lot to that. So.
Yeah, you have to decolonize the institutional norms, the policy procedures, and you have to build capacity along the way so that each of the players that are involved, right from the president down to the guy who comes and monitors the smoke alarms on this floor, that they're all involved, that they're all informed about the history, experience, and the necessity for this work. And so it's a year and a half of work to get to that place where you can have a feast here.
Where across the way, I could have just had a feast and a round dance in a couple weeks. The other thing I'd like to add is, and maybe, because this is still in draft and we're getting ready to submit it for publication, but we're still mulling it through. I want to stress UNDRIP number 19, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Number 19 is the duty to consult. And when you don't use the duty to consult, and it could be small, it could be asking Alma, it could be asking one of your colleagues who's Indigenous, a disaster can happen. And there's so many examples in this very faculty of where that is problematized. You have 4 now? Indigenous faculty here. And yes, I don't like to be asked all the time for things like, how do I offer tobacco? It gets frustrating. But I'd rather see me be asked than not, because the perfect example is the CRC and Reconciliation chair. I mean, every Indigenous scholar knows that that position would never no Indigenous person would apply for a CRC chair in Reconciliation, because Indigenous people don't feel that reconciliation's our work. We don't have to reconcile. We have nothing to apologize for. We have nothing to make amends for. So when no Indigenous scholars applied for that, there was a bit of a stun in the faculty, but not by us. If you would have asked us, we would have said, minimally add the word truth in there, or reconceptualize the position if you want an Indigenous scholar. Those are the little things that, with a duty to consult, if we don't take that seriously, we create bigger messes for ourselves. So probably having a nice person, a person earmarked like the executive lead of Indigenization for that would be great, so that you don't wear out your colleagues and stuff, but certainly think about your duty to consult when you're doing your work, if you're working with Indigenous peoples. I have a lot of well-intended students, well-intended colleagues who mean so well, but they didn't consult, and it turns out to be a disaster. And I've done it myself. I've gone into a remote northern Dene community with no clue what I was doing, didn't speak the language, and probably prior to going in, should have consulted. So I want to show you a picture of this model, but with, I'm not an artist, and Word doesn't allow for the way the model really should look, but I'll just show it to you. And then we're sending it to an artist to more capture what it really should look like. So here's where you would enter the ethical space, the two-eyed scene would be engaged, and then this really should be more fluid, right? So the trauma-informed should just kind of be, all this should be fluid and bouncing back and forth. And then once you get all that together, you would come out here and there would be capacity building here, there would be shared responsibility, you're grounded in treaty, your programs would be developed here, your medicine programs, your treatment programs, your education curriculum, OCAP, which is how data is protected in First Nations communities, ownership, control, access, and what's the P? Do you know the P? I forgot, sorry. Protection. Individual, community, family, cultural competency, and responsivity comes out here. So once we get the model fully drawn by an artist, it'll be more interactive. All of these would be sort of engaging like in and out like that. And so I've never birthed a theory. It's a very different way of being. It's taken over my, it's almost like the lenses I put on now in the morning. Everything I see is through this theory now. It's amazing. And it's been, I've used it in one-on-one counseling relationships. I consult first with what their needs are. I ask them what protocols they want, like not even Indigenous, like if they're Christian or if they're woman, what is it you need? So I'm using it, I'm playing it out in every way, and it works. So at some point we'll probably have to write a grant to actually test it, but so that the Western people will be happy. But we know it works. So that's the ICRT. in general.
Thank you for your work. I'm not good at models. When I look at them, my brain just sort of short circuits and I can't make sense. Could you tell me, using that model, how could this be used for somebody doing graduate work in Indigenous language revitalization?
So, and either anyone could chime in. The way I would see that is, are they working with a specific language group?
It would be a Cree Native community in northern Saskatchewan.
So how I would interpret it would be probably getting elders and language speakers from those areas into a space, circle, conversation, go into their community and sit down with them and ask them, first, do you have a protocol that you would like to open, like we opened in prayer today? How would you like to open this conversation? So whatever they bring forward, prayer, sweat, whatever, just conversations, up to them. And then I would say, what's worked traditionally for you in getting your language going? And then we would look at Western models of language revitalization, and we would say, what might work to bridge these two together? And then after that, I would make sure you're trauma sensitive and that you're coming from a strengths perspective. And then out of that, you could start to develop whatever that program looks like. So that's how I would engage it. Now, someone else might engage it differently, but that's what I would do.
We're using a very similar format for community engagement with Muscogin and area bands through the Touchwood Agency Tribal Council. So we'll be meeting with a number of different community groups. We'll start in that way, as JoLee's described it. We'll demonstrate a variety of different evidence-based Western ways of knowing to add to that discussion. And then we'll ask the community members to select the approaches that they think will be most meaningful and helpful in the process of determining a family-based healing and wellness center. So the healing program for that agency. So that looks like it's going to be some of our work for the next probably 3 to 8 years. Yeah.
The one thing I would say, though, is that this model does not fit well within a Western institution of higher education. Why? Well, look at the amount of time it's going to take. Again, this is position, if you want to decolonize this institution, this needs to be embraced. We need to have the space, time, and money to be able to go talk to our communities. This is the first time we've had elders and residents on a significant basis here. So, it took, I've been here 5-6 years now, and we're just getting kind of a little bit more solid money to have elders. They should have been engaged from the beginning. Position above the PhDs. This knowledge is crucial for us. As an Indigenous scholar who tries to disentangle what's happened to our people, I can't do it without elders, and shouldn't. My community would look at me as arrogant, and I've been called that because I haven't had the access to the elders unless I grant right and get it myself, which then adds another layer of challenge for my work. So this model, while it's great until the university starts to put some junior money where their decolonizing mouth is, it may not be able to happen.
Can I say something? I'd like to go back to your question. Could you ask the question again?
I said, how could this theoretical model be used for a graduate student who wants to do research in Indigenous language revitalization?
Okay. I guess that's my concern too. I think that's why I'm trying to do my master's and hopefully my doctorate degree. Because I've spoken the language since I was small. My late mother didn't speak any English at all. And my dad was fluent in both languages. But when I've been teaching the Cree language since I started to teach. And my concern with that is I was following the linear way of teaching. And I just couldn't do it, because that's not how I was brought up. I was brought up in the oral and always in that concept of the circle. That's where the language comes from. That's where our languages come from. First Nations, the different tribes, the concept is on land, on nature. That's the curriculum our ancestors followed. That was their curriculum. That's where their teachings came from. That's where the languages came from. That's the root of our language is to Mother Earth and everything that's on the land. And that's where the culture comes from. That's where our way of life stems from. So I'm trying to create a curriculum that will, the children can use, and that will bring in that root, that spirituality of the language to them, not broken up the way it's being taught, in linear way. They have a hard time to learn the language like that, and they have to hear it constantly. So it's very hard to bring because languages are dying off right now. But the older people seem to be coming back with it because they're attending the ceremonies. They hear the language there, and they're slowly picking it up, and they're getting really, really good because it's a spiritual thing. Our language is a spirit, so when you're in a spiritual place, you can connect with it. And if you really want to learn the language, you'll hear it, come to you at night. Your language teaches you. My parents are gone, they're both gone, but because I have the language, the teachings just keep going. I learned from the language by itself. There was, I have a daughter that was, had a Dakota teacher. She's got a pipe carrier, and now she's learning Dakota. At night, she'll hear words in the Dakota language, and she'll tell me, Mom, what does it mean? And I'd listen. That's not Cree, that's Dakota. Phone your teacher, and he'll tell you. So that language comes to you because it's all in us. That's our First Nations. It's in us. They just have to wake it up. And that's where that ceremonies are very, very important to us. The language will keep coming back. If we believe, if we believe in who we are, it'll come back to us. So I guess that's the challenge I have now, in curriculum development, to be able to connect the child to the spirit of that language, not just the words. So I don't know if it can be done in books, maybe, but it's got to be done in nature. It's got to be done, connecting the child to nature, with their surroundings and everything. So that's why animals are so important to us and the plants. Those are our teachers. That's where the teaching comes from. That's why when they say once they're gone, that's where that respect for land is important. That's why we have to respect every living thing, because if we don't, we're doing away with ourselves. We do away with those natural animals. Someday the domestic animals are not going to be there for you. Those animals that were put out there in nature, they can survive without you. But the domestic animals, you have to look after them. But the natural animals, Mother Earth looks after them, and they look after you. So that's where the connections are. That's why our way of life is so important. We have to hang on to it. That's why the circle is so important. Your strengths, your ideas, you build on one another's gift or whatever, the skills that you bring into that circle. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I have an example of that too. This summer I was up at the Sundance Ceremony in Takakoop, and I was sitting under the awning with all the women. It must have been 20 women, and my son, who's 4. And they're at a Sundance. When the Sundance is over, they leave the shell up. So there were 3 shells from previous Sundances, and one of the elders said to me, I remember when your son was named in that one, that first lodge 4 years ago. And I said, oh yeah. And then my son said, yes, and my name's Gisagao Pisim Kami Pimoteo. And everyone just went, hi, hi, hi. And then one elder started speaking to him in Cree, and he started speaking back. Now, my son knows words in both Cree and Ojibwe, but he's not a speaker, and we don't have access to a fluent language around him. I could not believe he spoke back to her in Cree. They had a conversation. To me, that was a spiritual moment that took over. Probably never be able to see that again. But I carry that with me, and having it witnessed and having had those women after that conversation happened just sort of hoop up, and like the chills that we got from it, it was the most powerful thing I've ever seen. And I remember taking the language in graduate school, and my elders would say, it's in you. And I kind of had to choose between graduate school or going, commuting to immersion once a month. And I remember at night just praying, like, if it's in me, just let it come out. Just let it, I would just ask for it to come forward. And, it never did for me, and it hasn't. And maybe because I haven't been around it enough on a consistent basis. But I do believe that it's in there. Having seen my son experience that, I think it's there. And it's probably best to get it with the children while we can get the children speaking.
May I make a suggestion? So it's based on law. So when I see this, and then you're saying that there's interconnections.
There is, yeah.
I think I'm thinking of Duluth, and you might want to look at Duluth's theory. And because of the circular nature of First Nations epistemology, I think I'm thinking of amoeba. So it's circular, U-shaped amoebas as part of your model, and then these amoebas are flexible enough to be able to go into your different circles, and so you have the ties in between them. But I think you would have to use the loops to try and see how that works. But it looks, yeah. I
Okay.
think that would be, and then what you could do if you're having somebody design it for you, you could have the different colors of, you could have the amoebas, in different colors that are sort of bleeding into each other, and then sort of stretching into here, and then getting into a color that mixes into here, so that there's always shifting and changing, and that it's not bounded.
Right.
But I think, if you look at Duluth, you might be able to see how that moves, because I think
We're turning everything over not just to an illustrator in a 3D kind of way, but to an animator, so that we can see the fluidity between the elements. I think that might be helpful. Yeah, that would be cool. Well, can I ask a question?
Sure.
But it's not for you, because it's for them.
Yeah.
Okay. As we've been going along, both decolonizing and indigenizing the work that we've been involved in, a common question that emerges for many of our colleagues is, how do we take up the suggestion that culture and ceremony offer us a way towards healing and wellness in an institute that likes to claim that it's secular? So how would you respond to those kinds of claims?
what does secular mean?
That it's
Separation.
This is a separation of
Church and state.
church and state, right? And so there's an assumption that what we're teaching is religion, right? So, I mean, I just want to have an open discussion around that, because it's a question I think we have to anticipate as we take the model elsewhere.
And I think, I don't know if that's related, but I have experienced getting challenged by saying that I'm essentializing Indigenous people,
Yeah,
by
exactly.
saying that we're spiritual. And it's not to say that some of us aren't spiritual because of colonization, but if you look at historically what our teachings are, we're spiritual people.
Look at holistic model of wellness. Spiritual is important. You have to be spiritual out. And so that to me is the response, is that you want to be holistic, you have to look at the whole being, and how one defines spiritual varies among cultures. I'm a religious studies teacher, so
It's true, the secular institutions will laud holistic practice in teaching and learning, and I really wonder where they got the buzzword from.
Yeah,
Because I
yeah.
often question, they understand what that means.
Exactly.
Before I lose my thought, I don't think of this place as a secular institution.
don't
It is a
either.
Christian institution.
I agree with you.
Our days of the week are based on Christianity.
Holidays.
Our holidays
Yeah.
are based on Christianity.
School closing and opening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Everything, and you see, notices from Luther College and Campion College. You don't see anything from the Islamic Student Center, or you don't see anything from the African student center, but it is a very Christian institution. And the philosophy that the students come into the, ontology and
Yes.
epistemology is all very Christian. So that when they're in the face of anything that is different, that's when
So-
it will start.
Exactly.
So I
There's that piece to it too. So I would say I posed the question quite purposefully because I actually want you to engage with our colleagues who are probably not saying those types of things to our faces, but are probably saying it behind the scenes. So as you hear comments from colleagues about, we have to maintain the secular institution, I want you to build your capacity to respond to that on your own without redirecting it back to us, because we're already doing the culture broker thing on the side, so we've got all that kind of responsibility to do. So if you can take that up and not respond to it for us and with us, that would be helpful.
So I'm sorry to interrupt. It is 1:04. I don't know if there's another class coming in or not. So I do have to unfortunately close up. I hope there's time for
I
discussion.
think it's important to go around once to see how, usually when you're sitting in a circle, you have to have time to put a little bit of a closer to your circle. Just to go around and check to see where everybody's at.
Maybe I'll pass this too. Can you just pass that when you?
be very long.
Is it just recording?
Share where you're at. Because you walk out and you're thinking, I should have said, and you're not finished.
I think I've said enough.
I think it was very interesting, and I agree that culture is a place to start and can bring people together and can definitely impact learning.
It's nice to have some words to follow some feelings I've had.
Thanks for your model. It's really beautiful and intelligent, and I'm proud of you for this model and the work that you do. I know we don't get a chance to speak, but I see that you're happening and shaking all over the building, turning things up, so that's good. I'm too busy teaching. I stay in my office and mark papers and teach right now, so eventually I'll come out and join you.
I look forward to reading your final paper, and I look forward to looking at some of the citations that I'm less familiar with. And I'm from over in both the Archer Library and the First Nations Library, and libraries in general and archival institutions, and this is going to be great to shake those buildings as well. Those buildings definitely, information institutions like that need a lot of shaking to them, so this is going to be fantastic.
Thank you. I'm also looking forward to reading the final publication. I am absolutely overwhelmed at the moment, and I was expecting that. So thank you for destabilizing me and giving me names of authors that I have yet to encounter. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Well, I too want to thank you for your hard work, because it's hard work breaking down old systems and barriers and challenging the status quo. And so I just am just delighted at the work you're doing. I'm sorry I was late, but it's so beautiful. And as I was looking at your image, what came to mind for me was the tree of life and the tanglement of the roots and how we are like layer upon layer upon layer of experience that can blossom to something really beautiful, which is what I see the work that you're doing. And that came to me at a silent meditation. I teach mindfulness meditation, and I was at a 5-day silent meditation retreat a week ago. And the tree of life came to me, and I sat on Mother Earth as part of my process of transformation and healing. And it was so beautiful to connect with the earth. And so if I'm ever challenged about indigenization, what I would say is, or what these cultures, these important cultures and rituals, is that if we truly want to be authentic in our commitment to indigenization, then the culture, the ceremony, the ritual, it's all integral to First Nations people, First Nations communities, in my experience. And I'm just so delighted that you're bringing that home. Our office just got moved to First Nations University. I feel like I came home.
Thank you very much for your work, and I'm leaving here today thinking about ethics in research and also what role this model and what role wellness might play in the lives of Indigenous people who are experiencing disability.
Thank you also. I'm kind of similar to you in that I'm overwhelmed and lots of unpacking happening in my brain. And looking forward to seeing what comes out of this and how I can maybe use it in my own research. So thank you again.
Well, thank you. I'm overwhelmed in so much as I've learned an awful lot in the past hour. An awful lot. It was so valuable. I'm just at the very birthing stage of learning about Indigenous epistemology, and so I thank you for that. In my work as a high school counselor, I see particular relevance to this. There's so many points that you brought up, JoLee, that you and I will talk further, so perhaps I could have you as a guest to address all of the counselors, in our school division at one point, because I think the relevance is just so clear. For example, I often say, well, why is that? I would have said, and I hate to say this, before I walked in the room today, well, I see a lot of ceremony and I see these things happening, but why is there so much emphasis on that? I might have said that, for example. Well, I'm not saying that anymore. I've learned so much, and I really thank you for that, and we'll be talking, for sure. Thank you.
Sorry, my PhD.
I think what's on my mind is the duty to consult, and I'm thankful that you reminded us of that, and that this whole theory is centered in the duty to consult.
And of course, I have another ask of you, not only to participate in decolonization, but to keep us in mind in your thoughts, your prayers, in whatever way you celebrate. Keep us in mind so that our heads are clear as we continue to do the work for our communities. Our intention is to help to address historic traumas and the influence that I hope that we have in training of mental health practitioners, educators, counselors, physicians, addiction services providers, like all of those people. We understand that it requires our two-eyed seeing too really well. We have to understand their beginning places and to work within our training, the implications for the training programs we hope to influence in ways that are sensitive to what their needs are, at the same time as trying to address the historic traumas in our own communities. So keep us in your prayers. Thank you for that. Thank you.
I just want to say that we're trying to get this submitted by the October 28th deadline to the International Indigenous Policy Journal. So look for that journal, and their call's out right now, so maybe in the next few months this article could be submitted. And also check out that journal in general. The bibliography for this paper is pretty astounding. There's some great Indigenous scholars on it. And then the people who said they're overwhelmed, I'm very aware of that. I'm getting ready to present this at a grand psychiatry round, and I'm still struggling with how to take these concepts and simplify them enough in a fast enough 1 hour snap and help people understand. And it's complex because I'm like, your feedback's crucial, and I still don't know how to do it. I'm glad people are saying they understood it. That helps me. But still, it's hard to get out of here and into here. So I just thank you for your feedback.